Here is Kathy Debchak. She comes from Penn State, where she is the Senior Extension Associate. She is the key person at Penn State working with the plastic culture program. And they work with high and low tunnels. And Kathy, just like Marvin, who's going to speak after, are both participants in the Tunnel Berries project, which is a larger USDA-funded project with many universities involved. Michigan State is the lead institution. Cornell and Penn State and others are involved as well, trying to look at growing berries in tunnels. Kathy, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. I feel special. Okay. Right, so AJ had mentioned this project that we have going on. That's a fairly large project. Okay, let's try turning it the other way. Alrighty, so this is the Tunnel Berries project. We do have a website that goes with that. There's a number of different aspects. You can see who all is involved with this. Rutgers as well. We're working with AJ on a venting part to the study. And we have an assortment of high tunnel and low tunnel projects that are taking place in different places. So I need to credit some folks for the information you're going to see today. Eric and the Michigan State team for pulling the grant and the project together. For a lot of the information you will see presented today, Mike Glenn at the USDA in Kearneysville, West Virginia did scans for us, helped produce data on some of the plastics. And then probably the project, I don't know if it would have really come together the way that it did without Nigel, Paul, and Jason Moore, who've been working on a lot of this type of work for some time. They're located over in the UK. So for this talk, we're going to talk about tunnel plastics, and we're really going to be focusing on the 6 mil plastic films that we'd be using. And that's our standard thickness normally for high tunnels. When we got samples of a bunch of different kinds, we were wondering whether, we had heard that some of the cheaper films might not be as thick as they say they are, but they all were. And these are the ones that you would normally have an expected life of 4 years with them. Now, there are some thinner plastics out there, and those are ones that are normally intended for some sort of shorter-term use, like maybe to get corn germinating, for example. In the springtime, you might have some thin vented plastic for over rows. Or if you're using them with plastic over low tunnels, it's easier to manipulate and tie the plastic when it's thinner. Now, if you want a plastic that lasts longer than 4 years, there are other types of materials out there. So there are some woven tunnel covers that you can buy. There are ones that are reinforced with like cotton or another fabric material through the plastic itself. There's some that are semi-rigid. And then there's also a type that looks almost like bubble wrap that can be put on a tunnel, and that requires a different system for attaching it. So as part of the project, one of the first goals was to identify what plastics are out there. We were interested in looking at plastics with different light transmittance characteristics, and we'll go into why that was a little bit later on. And so I thought maybe I'd identify, maybe 20, 30 plastics out there. Within a couple months of looking, I found 132 different plastics, and I said, oh, this is going to be a little more complicated than I thought. At least 51 of those were available in North America at the time. And so we got samples of all of those plastics, and then we also have some additional ones that we got last year. We identified and obtained most of these in 2015. And then we measured their characteristics related to light transmittance. So we were looking at transmittance through UV, visible, and infrared wavelengths. And we'll talk about what's important. We were also looking at diffusion, because some of the plastics are very clear and the light will come right through. Other ones, the light will be scattered some after it hits the plastic. And so one of the questions, whenever folks are starting out with high tunnels, sometimes they'll just want to go to a local hardware store or building supply store of some sort and get the plastic that's available there. And then the plastic becomes brittle and it breaks down within about a year if you use it. The ones that are used on tunnels have additives to prevent the plastic from breaking down in sunlight. And also other additives that might affect heat buildup and retention. I already mentioned diffusion, and there may be some either coatings or additives to affect condensation. So before you all go to sleep, I just want to explain there is a point to all this. So when you look at the whole spectrum of light that is hitting the plastic from sunlight, some of the light will be in UV range, some will be invisible, which obviously is what we can see and what makes the colors of the rainbow, and then infrared. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit. So the visible light is what we see. That's also what the plants are using for photosynthesis. So primarily in the ranges that we'll see as blue and red. Now there are uses for the other wavelengths, it turns out too, but related to photosynthesis, that's, you know, the primary wavelengths that the plants are using. And that's why if you look at grow lights or LED lights that you might be using, either, you know, if you're using the fluorescent grow lights, they'll have sort of a purple tinge to them, or if you're using LEDs, they'll look very purple. And most films that you would buy for a tunnel transmit between 85 and 90% of the plastic, of the light that's in the visible range. So they're all pretty good at that. And so that's enough to allow the plants to be working at pretty much their maximum, assuming they're not stressed by either temperature or water. And so this is the transmittance characteristics of one common plastic. And so basically the higher the line is, this is the percent transmittance, so that means the more that's coming through in those wavelengths. So this is the visible area, so these down towards this end and up towards this end is what's needed for photosynthesis. And so you can see there that pretty much nearly all the visible light is coming through. And so I mentioned diffusion. This is a clear plastic, and you can tell that you have a clear plastic because when you look through the tunnel, you can actually see the structure. You can see maybe which plants are being grown in there. The ones that tend to diffuse the light more are going to be more difficult to see through. And so you can just tell whether they are diffusing plastic or not pretty much by looking through them itself. So if it's clear plastic, you'll tend to see more shadows. And so that means the leaves will be shading each other to a greater extent. Generally, they will tend to build up more heat in those tunnels. If the light's being diffused, it just feels cooler to you. And so the light's scattered. It's also coming into the plant from different angles because it is being scattered. And so that means that you have less shading of the lower leaves. So if you're growing something like a taller crop, like perhaps tomatoes that are indeterminate or raspberries, a diffusing plastic could have some advantages that way. So basically, it may be possible. We haven't actually done the measurements, but logically, you could think that the plant may be able to accomplish more photosynthesis overall with a diffusing plastic, assuming that the light transmittance is the same. And so cucumbers are another crop where there might be a reason to have a plastic that diffuses the light. We do need some more work in this area. But if you look in general, in Europe and other places, the move seems to be towards plastics that do diffuse light more. Okay, so again, how do you know what you're buying when it comes to visible light transmittance? Generally, you'll be able to tell that from the literature, and a lot of them will specify a percentage of light transmittance that the plastics have. And most often they'll say that they have high light transmission, which is what you're looking for. If you have a plastic that's more diffuse, or you're looking at buying one that's more diffuse, the distributor may advertise that you're going to get less scorching or sun scald with that plastic because the light will be scattered. They may say that you're going to have less heat built up with it. And as I mentioned earlier, you can actually see the differences in the samples. Now, when we were doing our measurements, one of the things that surprised us, we thought we had some errors, but we were actually getting greater than 100% transmittance at some wavelengths, which was, we were wondering what was going on. But it turns out that what hits the plastic doesn't always come through at exactly the same wavelength. And so those numbers were actually real. And you may have seen this article that I believe was in Vegetable Growers News, I think, maybe, or last year. But you can get to the website here. And this is where a manufacturer was looking at an additive that actually allows the red and purple wavelength, or the red and blue wavelengths to come through, and then converts the other wavelengths that aren't being used so much for photosynthesis to produce electricity. And so if you look at this title right here, greenhouse photovoltaic panels give growers a second harvest of electricity without impacting plant growth. So that's sort of an interesting area that might be of use to all of us in the future. So going back, we're going to, there's our whole spectrum again. And now we're going to look at the UV light. So these were the wavelengths down in this range. And these aren't wavelengths that we're unfamiliar with. These are the same ones that cause tanning. So it's why we wear sunscreen, because they can not only tan us, but be the cause of skin cancer. They're also the ones that can damage your eyes, so that's why we're wearing sunglasses. You always see that, your sunglasses or your sunscreen protects you from a certain amount of UVA and UVB. And so this light is also, though, what makes the plants produce anthocyanins as well, or is at least involved, for part of that process. And so those anthocyanins are actually antioxidants. And if you think about it, the plants are exposed to the same sunlight we are, that we're putting sunscreen on to protect us. Plants can't put on sunscreen, but they can produce antioxidants and anthocyanins. So that results in some of the health effects for the berries. So as I mentioned earlier, with high tunnel plastics, there are either UV stabilizers or UV blockers that are added to the films, and so that's to prevent that plastic breakdown. And it turns out that when we were doing work in high tunnels, we were often noticing less disease, which we thought was purely due to the fact we were keeping moisture off of the plants. We also were noticing sometimes that insects like Japanese beetles didn't want to come into the tunnels so much. And so it may not have been entirely just the moisture. It turns out that some of the UVA wavelengths are used as a cue for sporulation of some of the diseases, and so that might have been contributing to the effects as well. UVA can be used is used for insect vision and navigation, and so that is likely why we were seeing at least some of the effects of the plastics on Japanese beetle behavior. So the question is, can we use these plastics, or can we use additives in some way to maybe affect insect behavior and perhaps decrease our need for pesticides? And one of the other things is that UVB can affect pesticide breakdown. And so that can be looked at as either a problem or maybe not so much. If it's an opportunity to get a longer life and greater efficacy, perhaps out of some of the materials that typically break down too quickly in the field. So for example, some of the organic materials and softer materials, we may only get an hour or two of efficacy out of them in the field. But under tunnel, there might be an opportunity to use some softer materials there to get control. So regarding pesticide breakdown, this is one tunnel plastic that does break, that does block some of the UVB and some of the UVA, but not all of it. And this is one that is actually probably one of the most commonly used plastics on tunnels here. And this one has a UV stabilizer instead of a UV blocker. So the UV actually does come through. So we're really not worried as much with pesticide breakdown with this plastic as we expected that we might need to be. And the only instance we know where there actually was a problem was with an experimental plastic that was being used in another country, Russia actually, that where all UV was being blocked, and then they did run into some issues with pesticide breakdown. But we are looking at that as part of this project, just to make sure we're not causing problems by using some of these films. So this is one film that is being marketed as being friendly to bees. And you'll see here it allows the UVA through right there. Prior to being marketed that way, when we got older samples, it actually was blocking a lot of this light. So the manufacturer was attempting to help out the bees there. So how do you know what you're buying? So pretty much all the high tunnel plastics are going to have something that's going to prevent that breakdown from UV light. So you may see either the words UV protected or UV stabilized, and you're likely to see the effects advertised, such as that bee friendly effect there. A lot of the company literature on the company websites does go into this information quite frequently, but sometimes you kind of need to dig around and look for the technical literature there. And then infrared, so these are the wavelengths that result in heat buildup in the tunnel. And so during the day, some of the longer wavelengths are visible that would have been in this area. Shorter waves of infrared heat up the tunnel during the day and are stored as heat in the soil or the plants or the media or whatever you have in the tunnel. And then they'll be emitted as longer wave infrared radiation at nighttime. And so if you look at the plastics that you might be buying, you may see the letters IR tacked onto the plastic name, okay? And these are usually plastics that will block those longer wavelengths of infrared light at nighttime. And so that means that you will not need perhaps so much heating in a greenhouse, for example, overnight, or if you need to add some supplemental heating to a greenhouse where you might be growing fall greens, the intent is to keep some of the heat in. And so there are some other ones that will block shorter wave infrared, and the intent is to reduce the heat buildup during the day. And so those plastics will often be marketed as reducing temperatures, daytime temperatures. And what's difficult is to separate out the effect of light diffusion, because a lot of these plastics also diffuse light. And so how to sort out what's blocking infrared versus what is just diffusing the light, because some will do both. But often on some of these plastics, you will notice that the temperatures feel surprisingly cool when you walk into a tunnel that has these types of plastics on. And often they'll have the word cool or something indicating that they are a plastic that tends to stay a little cooler during the day in the name of the plastic. Okay, and so this is one that would not block infrared because you can see we have high light transmittance down this range. And this is one that does block some of it. And this is one where at our research farm, whenever workers were walking into these tunnels, they just said it just felt cooler to them. And so for a crop like raspberries, it might want cooler temperatures. This is important. Okay, so again, how do you know what you're buying? Usually it's specified in the literature, maybe advertised as a cooling plastic. You might see the letters IR or TES for standing for thermal energy saving in the film name. So you know what you're getting. Now you know what's going on behind the scenes, maybe, to make those plastics what they are and to make them work the way that they do. So some of the other characteristics, you might see the letters AC in the name. These are ones that have an anti-condensate additive. And well, generally, the intent is to keep water from dripping onto your plants so you don't have disease build up in the tunnel. And so one of two things will happen. Either the water will remain a small droplet that clings to the plastic, or the water may spread out and run down the tunnel sides. So when you get plastics that have an anti-condensate feature, if it's a coating, the plastic may be marked that one side needs to be either down or inward on the tunnel, and that will be printed on the plastic itself. And so you want to pay attention to that whenever you get the plastic. If you don't see that stamped on the plastic, it is like 99% likely that it doesn't matter which side is up because it's something incorporated into the plastic. So the only way you might run into a problem is sometimes you'll go out and you'll cut the pieces of plastic you need for your tunnel. And if you happen to make the cut where you can't see the writing anymore on some of the smaller pieces, which has happened to us, it can nearly put you in a panic, at least if you're doing research and with them. But you can almost always tell if you look at both sides of the plastic, the side with the coating will be less reflective, whereas the side that doesn't have the coating will look a little shinier, and that's the side that should be facing up. So you want that less reflective side facing towards the inside. Okay? And then, as I mentioned, sometimes those additives are incorporated into the plastic, and then it doesn't matter which side is up. And AG, feel free to jump in if I say anything off track here. So anyhow, so then you might also see the letters AD, and that stands for anti-dust. And so the plastics may have an additive that is intended to repel the dust so that your light transmission stays higher and you don't have dirt accumulating on it. So most of the plastics will have some combination of these features. Okay, so you might see the words clear for ones where the light can just come through. UVClear may have a combination of UV blocking characteristics, but still be clear regarding visible. Whoopsie, we're going the wrong way. We're out of control. You might see IR. Oh, God. Let's see if I can control this thing. Infrared okay. Does somebody else want to take this away from me and control it? I think I'm just hitting it with my thumb. So anyway, you may see IR for infrared blocking, or IRAC, or some combination of letters that mean what features these plastics have. But I just say talk to the manufacturer, find out what their plastics should do, what they think the uses should be for the plastic, and tell them which crops you're intending to grow, because they may be able to help you pick out the right plastic. Most manufacturers will have an assortment of plastics that have an assortment of these features. Okay, so the question becomes, all right, do differences in plastics pay? And so one of the things we wanted to look at was the cost per square foot of some of these plastics. And we expected that we were going to find some sort of a significant difference in the prices of plastics with these different features. And we really didn't. Those differences in price were fairly minuscule, as long as you were comparing 6 mil plastics. There was actually a much bigger range in prices between different distributors of the very same brand of plastic. So if you have a choice of buying from a couple of distributors that are nearby, you might want to check the price. But what could just, make all of that almost immaterial is the shipping costs, because that can be anywhere between 10 and 40%. Our commercial sized tunnels, which we were using, although I understand a lot of wider tunnels that are being used now, and think about it, the plastic that would cover a 17 by 96 foot tunnel weighs about 130 pounds. So this plastic isn't light, and shipping can be significant. So but we are doing economic analyses as part of the project, looking to see whether differences in different types of plastic might result in yield differences. And so, the theory's all good. The question is, does it really amount to anything when it comes to yields or diseases or insects? And so as part of the project, what we have, this is the the High Tunnel Research and Extension Facility at Penn State. It at one point had, I think 32 was our maximum number of tunnels. And the facility had been built starting in 1999 with some additional tunnels added. And so we hit a point where pretty much the wood was getting very old. A lot of it was rotting. And so basically what we did is we stripped down these tunnels. Some of the tunnels had actually been sold as funding had decreased for this kind of work for a while. So we ended up putting some tunnels back. And so we have 15 with 5 different types of plastic on them now in a replicated study, looking to see what the differences might be, wiring them up for microenvironmental monitoring. These are with Raspberry Pis. With AJ, we'll be doing work on venting where we'll be using a different type of data logger. And in these tunnels, we're actually growing everything in pots because we wanted to be able to pick up any differences in the plastics. Because the different tunnels had been used for different crops over the years and for different lengths of time, the soil was actually very different in the different tunnels, both in pH and in terms of nutrient levels. And so we wanted to make sure that any differences we were picking up were were not due to the soil, that they were actually due to the plastic. So we ended up growing everything in pots. So we're growing both 2 varieties of raspberries, and Josephine, and then these are Albion strawberries here, which we actually just planted this past year in June. I was surprised at the production we were getting off of the raspberries already. We started harvesting about 3.5 months after we planted them. And then these were our Albion down there in the lower right corner. We had a really bad year with Japanese beetles in our area. And besides having the plastics in the tunnels, we also had some outside that were in pots that were getting absolutely decimated by Japanese beetles. And so, but we were, well anyway, it gave us an opportunity, I guess, to collect data. That always happens in our research trials. Whatever comes along, we're going to count it. It almost doesn't matter. So we plucked off Japanese beetles, counted them. We actually came back every day and plucked off Japanese beetles and counted them, and then we actually removed them from the field so that they weren't, so we weren't counting the same ones over and over. And so if you looked at the first day when we did that, which was July 12th or 13th, this is off of 12 plants. Okay, we were collecting nearly an average of 6 beetles per plant off the outside plants, sometimes a little less for the first little stretch. And so these were the outside plants. These were underneath our 5 different kinds of plastic. This one right here is an experimental one that does block all of the UV, and we almost had no beetles whatsoever on those plants, which was really interesting. The outside plants were hitting the point where they were pretty well by the time we got to this end. This is a Julienne date, but this is after, what do we have there, eight days or so. I was really worried those outside plants were just going to get demolished, so we picked them up, moved them into the tunnel that had the UV blocking plastic, and we never got it. We thought there would be the pheromones there and maybe beetles would start to come in. None of them did. So we basically were able to save the plants just by moving them into the tunnel. So we want to continue to get data on that and see if we can do some work with that. We were finding when we had Japanese spotted-winged Drosophila traps, we were still getting infestation in the fruit in the tunnels. The number in our traps that were in the tunnels were actually quite a bit lower. We think we do actually have some differences between the plastics on spotted-winged Drosophila as well. But this is only 1 year's worth of data, so I don't want to get too excited yet. But I'm hopeful that things will work. So we're also doing some work with low tunnels together with Marv. Also folks in New Hampshire doing low tunnels work as well. We're using the same 5 plastics on the low tunnels. As I mentioned, 2 of them are actually experimental, not all of them are on the market. And we have the low tunnels over white, black, or no plastic mulch. And again, we're using the Albion. And so this is what Albion is looking like underneath the tunnels. And so we are finding some differences in diseases. We also have some differences in yield, but we're getting way less anthracnose under the low tunnels. We're getting higher yields with all the plastics versus none. And we do still need to analyze a lot of the data, but what's interesting is that with the combination of plastics and plastic mulch, we're actually getting less anthracnose when we're using the black plastic mulch underneath some of these tunnels, and if we don't have any tunnel at all. Whereas we're getting higher anthracnose with the white plastic mulch on the field, which was the exact opposite of what we expected. So we're trying to take a look at that data too, but we did have consistent differences across a couple different dates where it looks like we can affect anthracnose incidence as well. So we're going to keep working on this. We've got another 3 years on the project. I want to put this website up. I want to thank some other folks, USDA, SCRI for funding. There were a number of grower groups that contributed, companies who provided plastics to us. Rimmel Greenhouses and Advancing Alternatives are supplying us with some materials for the venting studies with AJ. And this is just our standard disclaimer, so we know that if I say something it's wrong, it's not USDA's fault.